In the serene valley town of Pine Haven, where autumn leaves whisper secrets of those who serve, a group of reckless motorcycle riders made the most regrettable mistake of their lives. They chose to mock the wrong woman in a wheelchair completely, unaware that combat nurse Sarah Mitchell had saved more lives under enemy fire than they'd ever encounter in their lifetime. The community center on Maple Street had stood as Pine Haven's gathering place for generations. Its red brick walls and white columns held decades of stories, laughter, and tears. Here, Sarah Mitchell guided her wheelchair with practiced precision. Through the morning crowd, each movement calculated and smooth as she made her way to her usual spot near the window. Her weathered hands, marked with barely visible scars that told stories she rarely shared, arranged her medical supplies for the day's free clinic with meticulous care. Lisa Thompson, the center's director, worked quietly at the reception desk, her reading glasses catching the morning light as she sorted through appointment records. For 3 years, she'd watched Sarah run this clinic with unwavering dedication, never questioning why such a skilled medical professional chose to offer free care in their small town rather than work at a prestigious hospital. "Sometimes I think you organize these supplies just to keep your hands busy," Lisa said, looking up from her paperwork. Sarah's lip curved slightly in what passed for a smile these days. "Everything needs a purpose, Lisa," she replied softly, her voice carrying that gentle quality that made patients lean in closer to hear. The clinic held its usual morning crowd. Elderly Mr. Anderson waiting for his blood pressure check, young mother Maria Ramirez with her feverish toddler, and Dr. David Chen reviewing patient files in the corner. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, stirring air that smelled of antiseptic and fresh coffee. Officer Mark Reynolds' radio crackled to life, breaking the peaceful quiet. He listened intently, his face growing serious. Sarah's hands slowed imperceptibly on the bandage she was rolling, though her expression remained neutral. "Trouble?" she asked as Reynolds approached her station. The officer's boots squeaked softly on the polished floor. "Maybe," he sighed, setting his coffee cup down. "Got word from River City that a motorcycle gang, the Valley Riders, has been causing problems at medical facilities. Second one this month." Lisa, her appointment book forgotten, moved closer. "What kind of problems?" Reynolds grimaced. "They've been harassing staff, particularly those with disabilities, making some kind of twisted point about natural selection and who should be providing medical care. Been filming it for their social media too." Sarah set down her supplies with precise care. "How far out?" 20 miles now," Reynolds replied, watching her face carefully. "Moving this way, leader goes by Tank, Jake Turner, ex-military dishonorable discharge, has a particular issue with medical personnel who aren't what he calls physically perfect." The morning light caught the silver in Sarah's hair as she reached for another roll of gauze. Most people would have missed it, but Lisa saw how her movements had changed, become more controlled, more measured, like someone carefully holding something in check. Dr. Chen spoke up from his corner, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge. "Might be time to consider closing the clinic temporarily, Sarah. Town this size, Mark here can't be everywhere." Sarah's hands stilled, completely for a moment. "A clinic this size shouldn't need protection," she said quietly. "Not if people remember what it means to respect those who serve others." The rumble of motorcycles echoed from somewhere down the street, drawing everyone's attention. It passed without stopping, but the tension in the room didn't fully dissipate. Lisa watched as Sarah methodically arranged medical supplies, her movements precise as ever, but now carrying a different quality, like a caged eagle trying to move like a sparrow. "Let's take a quick break. Where are you tuning in from? If this kind of content speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is something truly special." Mr. Anderson spoke up suddenly from his chair, his voice rough with age. "I've heard stories about these Valley Riders. say they particularly enjoy targeting medical staff, filming their harassment, making examples of people they think don't belong in healthcare. Sarah's reflection in the clinic window showed no reaction, but Lisa noticed how her right hand had settled in her lap, where a flight medic's kit might once have rested. Some habits, it seemed, never quite died. "Respect," Sarah said quietly, almost to herself, "isn't earned by tearing others down." The morning light continued to fade as clouds gathered outside, casting the clinic in deepening shadows. Through the window, they could see more bikes passing slowly, their riders studying the building with obvious interest. Pine Haven had earned its name from the towering pines that surrounded it, offering shelter to those who needed it. Now, watching Sarah's controlled movements near the window, Lisa wondered if those pines would witness another kind of shelter being offered. The kind that came not from trees, but from those who'd learned to stand firm in the face of storms. Officer Reynolds finished his coffee and stood, adjusting his utility belt with practiced ease. "I'll make some calls. See about getting backup from the county if we need them." 2 hours, Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. The officer paused at her certainty. "You seem mighty sure about that timing." "Just arithmetic, Mark," Sarah said softly. "Nothing more." But her words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath for what was to come. The late morning sun struggled through gathering clouds as more motorcycles rumbled past the Pine Haven Community Center. Sarah continued her work, her movements maintaining their precise efficiency, but her eyes now regularly scanned the street through the front windows. She'd seen this pattern before, back in her Air Force days, the slow circling, the gathering of intelligence, the psychological groundwork before an assault. Lisa watched from the reception desk as Sarah helped Mrs. Chen with her diabetes check, noting how her friend's wheelchair movements had subtly changed. Each position she took now seemed carefully calculated, always maintaining clear lines of sight to both exits. Even the way she arranged her medical equipment had shifted, keeping essential items within quick reach. "You've seen something like this before, haven't you?" Lisa asked quietly when the last morning patient had left. Sarah's hands stilled momentarily on her stethoscope. "Different place, different time," she replied softly. "But the tactics, the psychology, that stays the same. People who need to prove their superiority, they always follow a pattern." Through the window, they watched as 2 riders dismounted their bikes across the street. Their leather vests displayed the Valley Riders emblem, a stylized eagle crushing a serpent. The larger man pulled out a phone, obviously recording while his companion pointed at the clinic's wheelchair access ramp. Officer Reynolds entered through the back door, his face tight with new information. "Just got word from River City. Their free clinic got hit yesterday. 2 nurses quit after the harassment, one with 20 years experience. They're not just targeting the disabled," Dr. Chen added, joining them by the window. "They're trying to drive away anyone who supports us, creating division, spreading fear." He paused, studying Sarah's reflection in the glass. "Making examples." Sarah's wheelchair turned with military precision as she faced them. "Tell me about their leader." "Tank. What wasn't in the official reports?" Reynolds sighed heavily, settling into a chair. "Jake Turner, former Army medic, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Something happened during his second tour. Incident with a civilian medical team. Details are classified, but he came back changed, started preaching about medical purity. This twisted ideology about only the physically perfect having the right to treat others. Trauma can break people in different ways," Sarah observed quietly, her hands automatically organizing supplies on her desk. "Some let it turn them cruel, make them need to prove their strength by hurting others. And some," Lisa added softly, Watching her friends' controlled movements, let it teach them how to protect others from similar pain. The afternoon brought more valley riders to Pine Haven. They traveled in small groups, 3 or 4 bikes at a time. Each passed by the clinic more deliberate than the last. Local shops began closing early, parents hurried their children home, and an uneasy silence settled over the usually bustling streets. Sarah maintained her routine, seeing patients, changing dressings, checking vital signs. But now, everyone noticed how she positioned her wheelchair, always facing the doors, always. Aware of approaching engine sounds, the calm efficiency that had once seemed merely professional now carried an edge of something else, something forged in places where medical skills meant the difference between life and death. "Got more information," Reynolds announced, returning from a patrol. Tank's been recruiting specifically from discharged medical personnel, building some kind of twisted brotherhood dedicated to purifying the healthcare system. Their social media's full of manifestos about strength and natural selection. "Making it personal," Sarah noted, her voice carrying that quiet certainty that made others pay attention.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It's not just about harassment anymore. He's building an ideology, creating a cause that justifies cruelty. Through the clinic windows, they watched as more riders gathered at the diner across the street. Their leather vests caught the afternoon, light, the eagle emblems seeming to gleam with malicious intent. One rider, larger than the rest, stood out, his vest decorated with medical insignia perverted into symbols of power rather than healing. "That's him," Reynolds confirmed. "Tank." Sarah studied the man through the window, her trained eye noting details others might miss. Military bearing despite the swagger, favors his left side. Old injury, probably. The way he positions his men, he's still thinking like a medic, maintaining coverage, establishing triage points. "How can you tell all that from here?" Lisa asked, amazed at her friend's observation skills. "Same way I can tell the 2 by his bike are ex-combat medics. Their unconscious positioning, the way they scan for threats. Same way I know the one filming is new to their group, still hesitant, still carrying his old training in how he stands." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her hands had settled on her wheelchair's arms with subtle tension. The afternoon light caught Tank's face as he turned toward the clinic. Even at this distance, the cruel anticipation in his expression was clear. He raised his phone, obviously recording, and made a show of studying the clinic's wheelchair access signs. "Sending a message," Sarah said quietly, her wheelchair turning with smooth precision to face the window fully. "Making sure we know what's coming." "We should call the county," Lisa suggested, reaching for the phone. "Won't get here in time," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that same certainty they'd heard earlier. "And that's exactly what he's counting. On small town, limited resources, fear of escalation." She paused, her hands moving automatically to check her medical supplies. It's what people like him always count on, the hesitation of good people to stand against cruelty. The afternoon wore on, each passing hour marked by more arriving riders, more phones recording, more subtle intimidation. Through it all, Sarah maintained her duties with unwavering focus. But now everyone saw the military precision in her movements, the tactical awareness in her positioning, the combat nurse's efficiency in her actions. "You're not just worried about harassment, are you?" Dr. Chen asked quietly during a private moment. "You think this is building to something worse?" Sarah's hands stilled on the blood pressure cuff she was preparing. Men like Tank, they don't just want to intimidate. They need to prove something, need to make examples that justify their twisted worldview. Her eyes met Chen's. Need to show that their kind of strength is the only kind that matters. Outside, the gathering clouds mirrored the darkness growing in Pine Haven's streets. Tank and his Valley Riders had brought more than just intimidation to their small town. They'd brought an ideology of hatred masked as strength, of cruelty disguised as natural law. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd chosen to target a combat nurse who'd learned her lessons about strength and service, not in peaceful clinics, but under enemy fire, where true courage meant staying with the wounded when others fled, where real strength meant using your skills to heal rather than harm. As the shadows lengthened across Pine Haven, Sarah Mitchell continued her preparations, each movement measured, each decision calculated. The storm was coming, but storms were nothing new to someone who'd learned to save lives, while missiles lit the desert sky. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic's windows as Sarah finished with her last scheduled patient. Outside, the Valley Riders had grown bolder, their bikes now parked directly in front of the community center, engines revving periodically in an obvious display of intimidation. Through the glass, they could see Tank organizing his people, positioning them with the calculated precision of someone who understood tactical advantage. His phone remained raised, recording everything, waiting for the moment to create the confrontation he clearly craved. "Sarah," Lisa said quietly, watching two riders block the wheelchair ramp with their bikes. "Maybe we should close early. Most patients are done for the day." Before Sarah could respond, the clinic's door swung open with deliberate force. Two riders entered, their leather vests bearing both the Valley Riders' eagle emblem and perverted medical insignias. The larger one, who introduced himself as Spike, made a show of looking around the clinic, his phone recording everything. "Quite a setup you got here," he announced, his voice carrying false friendliness that set everyone's teeth on edge. His companion remained by the door, positioned to watch both the street and Sarah. Sarah continued organizing her supplies, her movements unhurried. "We manage," she replied, her voice carrying that quiet tone that made others lean in to hear. Spike picked up a blood pressure cuff, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated care. Must be challenging, though, working from that chair. All those limitations, all those restrictions. He set the equipment down with deliberate negligence. Might need some help running things here. Someone more capable. "We managed just fine," Dr. Chen interrupted, stepping forward, but Sarah's raised hand stopped him. "Interesting thing about limitations," Sarah said softly, her wheelchair turning with precise control to face Spike fully. "They teach you what really matters, teach you the difference between showing strength and having it." Something in her voice, in the way she positioned her chair, made both riders exchange glances. The man by the door shifted his weight slightly, hand dropping toward his vest pocket. "That's twice today you've reached for something while trying. To intimidate medical personnel," Sarah observed calmly, "might make someone wonder about your actual confidence in your position." The man froze, caught off guard by both the observation and the absolute certainty in her voice. Spike studied Sarah with narrowed eyes, his earlier mocking tone sharpening. "Pretty observant for someone who spends their days taking blood pressure readings," he said, moving closer to her wheelchair. "Simple observation," Sarah replied, her hands resting lightly on her wheels. To most, she would appear relaxed, but Officer Reynolds, watching from near the reception desk, recognized something in her posture, a readiness that preceded swift action. Through the windows, they could see Tank watching the scene unfold, his phone still recording. Spike seemed to draw confidence from his leader's attention, leaning down toward Sarah's chair. "Way I see it," he said, voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You've got two choices. One, you close this clinic, admit that some people aren't meant for medical care, save yourself some embarrassment. Two," he let the threat hang in the air. "There's always a third choice," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying that same deadly certainty they'd heard earlier. "Yeah? What's that?" You walk out that door, take your bikes off our ramp, and remember that true medical professionals serve everyone, not just those they deem worthy." Her eyes met his, and for a moment something flickered in them that made Spike straighten up involuntarily. Remember that strength isn't about intimidation. It's about staying when others run, serving when others hide. One of Tank's men laughed from the doorway, but the sound died quickly when he caught sight of Sarah's expression. Even seated, something about her presence had shifted, becoming more substantial, more commanding. "You're threatening us?" Spike asked, his earlier confidence wavering slightly. "No," Sarah replied, her wheelchair moving with fluid precision to position herself between the riders and her medical supplies. "I'm reminding you of something you seem to have forgotten. Medical service isn't about proving superiority. It's about being there when people need help most." The atmosphere in the clinic changed, becoming charged with potential energy. Tank's men shifted uneasily, sensing something had changed, but not understanding what. The false bravado they'd entered with seemed to evaporate under Sarah's steady gaze. "Just passing through," Spike said finally, his earlier mockery somewhat diminished. "Thought folks might want to know about some changes coming to local healthcare." "Consider us informed," Sarah replied, returning to her work with measured movements that somehow made her wheelchair seem less like a limitation and more like a position of command. The riders left shortly after, their departure marked by unnecessarily loud engines. Through the window, they watched Tank receive their report, his expression darkening as he studied Sarah through the glass. "That was either very brave or very dangerous," Dr. Chen observed quietly. "Sometimes they're the same thing," Sarah replied, her hands moving automatically to straighten supplies that Spike had disturbed. "Sometimes standing your ground is the only way to prevent worse violence later." Lisa approached Sarah's station, noting how her friend had positioned her wheelchair to maintain clear sightlines to all entries. "You've done this before, haven't you? Faced down people who thought they could intimidate you." Sarah's reflection in the window showed no reaction, but her hands stilled momentarily on the blood pressure cuff. "Different place, different time," she said softly. "But bullies follow patterns. They mistake kindness for weakness, service for submission. They forget that some of us learned our skills in places where weakness wasn't an option." Officer Reynolds moved to the window, watching Tank organize his men for departure. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "Men like that, they can't let a challenge go unanswered, especially not from someone they think should be an easy target." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that quiet certainty again. "They need to prove something now, need to show their strength by trying to break someone they see as weak." Her eyes met Reynolds in the window's reflection. "Need to learn the hard way that real strength isn't about what you can break, it's about what you choose to protect." As the afternoon deepened into evening, the Valley Riders gradually dispersed, but their presence left a tangible tension in the air. Through the clinic windows, Sarah watched them depart, her trained eye noting how they maintained communication, how they marked positions, how they filmed everything, gathering intelligence for what was clearly planned as a larger confrontation. "You should let us help," Reynolds offered. "Get county involved before this escalates." "Too late for that," Sarah replied softly, her wheelchair turning with military precision to face the gathering darkness. "Men like Tank, they don't back down once they've chosen a target. Now it's just a question of when they'll return and what they'll try to prove." The evening light caught her profile as she spoke, and for a moment those present saw past the quiet medical professional to something else, something forged in combat zones, something that understood that sometimes healing meant standing firm against those who would do harm. "They think they've found an easy target," she continued, her voice carrying that same quiet strength that had made hardened riders step back. think they've found someone they can use to prove their twisted philosophy about strength and worthiness. Her hands moved automatically to check her supplies, each motion carrying the precision of someone who had learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. What they've actually found, she finished softly, is someone who learned about real strength in places where weakness meant death, where service meant staying with the wounded when others fled, where true worth was measured not in intimidation, but in how many lives you could save. The evening shadows lengthened across Pine Haven as Lisa helped Sarah close the clinic for the night. Through the windows, they could still see occasional valley riders passing by, their bikes moving slower, now more purposeful in their surveillance. "Sarah," Lisa said quietly, watching her friend methodically secure medical supplies, "I think it's time you told me the real story. About your service, about what you did before coming here." Sarah's hands stilled on the cabinet locks and, for a moment, she sat perfectly motionless in her wheelchair. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories long kept silent. "Telling means remembering," she said softly, "and some memories come with prices." Officer Reynolds entered through the back door, his face grave with new information. "Just got word from my contact at the Air Force. Found out why Tank has such a specific hatred for medical personnel with disabilities. Why this isn't just about harassment anymore." Sarah turned her wheelchair with measured precision to face him. "Tell me." 3 years ago in Afghanistan, Tank, Jake Turner, was leading a medical evacuation team. Something went wrong. Reports are redacted, but... Reynolds met Sarah's eyes. "It was your unit, wasn't it? You were there." Dr. Chen, who had stayed late out of concern, moved closer as Sarah's expression shifted subtly. For the first time, they saw something more than the quiet medical professional they'd known. "Kandahar province," Sarah began, her voice taking on a distant quality. "We were running emergency evacuations during a major offensive. Tank's team was supposed to provide ground support while we handled air medical operations." Her hands moved unconsciously to her legs as she spoke. "He had different ideas about priorities." Lisa settled into a chair, sensing the importance of what was coming. Sarah continued, her voice steady but carrying echoes of old pain. "Tank believed in what he called efficient triage, treating only those he deemed worth saving, the strongest, the most physically perfect. He'd ignore civilians, disabled soldiers, anyone he considered unworthy." Her eyes focused on a point far beyond the clinic walls. "That day, we had multiple casualties. Local children's hospital had been hit. Dozens of young patients, many with existing disabilities or chronic conditions." Reynolds leaned against the wall, realization dawning. He refused to help them. "Worse," Sarah replied quietly. "He was going to leave them to create space for what he called priority casualties, the physically fit soldiers he deemed more worthy of saving. Said it was natural selection in action." "What did you do?" Lisa asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. "What any real medical professional would do. I disobeyed his ground order, landed my medical helicopter right in the middle of the chaos. My team and I started evacuating everyone we could reach, children, disabled patients, elderly civilians." Sarah's voice carried steel beneath its quietness. "Tank tried to stop us, said we were contaminating the natural order." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "That's when it happened, wasn't it, your injury?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Tank's team was supposed to provide cover fire while we loaded patients. Instead, he ordered his men to withdraw, leave us exposed. Said if we wanted to waste resources on the weak, we could face the consequences." Her hands gripped her wheelchairs, arms tightly. "Enemy fire hit our helicopter just as we were lifting off with the last group of children. Took a bullet in my spine but managed to keep us in the air long enough to get those kids to safety." The evening light through the windows cast long shadows as Sarah continued. Flew that chopper with no feeling in my legs, running on pure adrenaline and determination. My team kept the patient stable while I focused on staying airborne. We lost the helicopter on landing, but didn't lose a single patient. You saved them all, Lisa whispered. Saved them, yes, but Tank's actions had consequences beyond my injury. His abandonment of duty led to his dishonorable discharge, but the investigation was quietly handled. Military didn't want the public relations nightmare of a medical officer advocating survival of the fittest in a combat zone. Reynolds straightened suddenly. That's why he's really here, isn't it? He recognized your name when the clinic opened. Probably, Sarah agreed, softly. To him, I represent everything he hates. A disabled medical professional not only practicing, but thriving, helping others regardless of their physical condition, proving every day that his ideology is wrong. And now he wants revenge, Doctor, Chen concluded grimly. More than that, Sarah corrected, he wants vindication, wants to prove his philosophy right by breaking someone he sees as an example of everything he fought against. Her wheelchair turned to face the window, where another Valley rider passed slowly by, wants to show that strength only belongs to those who match his definition of perfection. Lisa watched her friend's reflection in the darkening glass, seeing now what had always been there. The straight spine of a combat veteran, the steady hands of a flight medic, the watchful eyes of someone who had learned to protect others at any cost. That's why you started this clinic, isn't it? She asked quietly. Not just to provide medical care, but to prove that service knows no limitations. Partly, Sarah admitted, but also because I learned something in that helicopter that Tank never understood. Real strength isn't about physical perfection or dominance. It's about being there for others when they need you most, about using whatever abilities you have to help those who need help. Through the windows, they could see more Valley riders gathering at the diner across the street. Tank stood among them, his phone raised, obviously recording the clinic again. He's planning something, Reynolds observed. This harassment, these intimidation tactics, it's building to something bigger. I know, Sarah replied, her voice carrying that quiet certainty they'd come to recognize. Men like Tank, they need grand gestures, public demonstrations of their twisted philosophies. Her hands moved automatically to check her medical supplies, each motion carrying the precision of combat experience. Need to prove they're right about strength and weakness, about who deserves care and who doesn't. Deke, what they actually prove, she continued softly, her reflection in the window showing not just the quiet medical professional but the combat nurse who had faced down death to save others, is that they never understood what real strength is, never learned that true power isn't in what you can destroy, but in what you choose to protect. The evening deepened into night as Sarah shared more of her story, about other evacuations, other moments where choices between protocol and humanity had to be made, other times when being right meant standing alone against those who would abandon their duty. Through it all, her voice remained steady, her hands continued their precise movements, but now everyone saw these actions for what they truly were, not just medical professionalism, but the ingrained habits of someone who had learned to stay calm and focused in the midst of chaos. You could have told us before, Lisa said finally, about your service, about what you did. Telling isn't always helping, Sarah replied, her wheelchair turning away from the window with military precision. Sometimes the best service is quiet, letting your actions speak instead of your words. Her eyes met each of theirs in turn. But sometimes, when the storm is coming, people need to understand exactly what they're standing with and exactly what they're standing against. Outside, Tank's voice carried across the street as he addressed his gathered riders, his words, indistinct but his tone clear. a leader rallying his followers for what he planned as a decisive action. But he had made one crucial mistake in choosing his target. He'd mistaken silence for weakness, wheels for limitation, and quiet service for submission. He was about to learn what his superiors in Afghanistan had learned, that sometimes the strongest warriors aren't those who can destroy, but those who will risk everything to heal and protect. Dawn painted Pine Haven's sky in shades of grey and purple as Sarah arrived at the clinic earlier than usual. Her wheelchair moved silently across the polished floors as she began her preparations, each motion carrying new meaning now that her colleagues understood their military precision. Lisa found her checking the locks on the back door, her fingers moving with practiced expertise over the mechanisms. "Those are new," she observed, setting down her purse. "Installed them last night," Sarah replied quietly, testing the door's movement. "Old ones were too loose." Her hands moved over the frame with a knowledge that seemed beyond simple maintenance. "You know about doors?" Lisa asked, watching her work. Sarah's lips curved slightly. "Used to, in another life." She straightened, in her wheelchair, scanning the back alley through the door's small window. Different kinds of doors, different reasons for checking them. The morning passed with increasing tension as news filtered in. Mary from the pharmacy reported 3 Valley Riders watching her store, making notes about staff movements. The coffee shop owner described more riders studying the clinic's patient traffic patterns, recording everything on their phones. Officer Reynolds entered around 10, his face tight with concern. "Got more reports from River City," he said, settling near Sarah's station as she organized supplies. 2 more clinics shut down after sustained harassment. 1 nurse hospitalized, accidental collision with a motorcycle. Sarah's hands stilled on the gauze she was rolling. "The nurse? She'll recover," Reynolds replied grimly. But Tank made sure everyone knew it wasn't really an accident, made a video about natural consequences for those who enable medical weakness. Dr. Chen joined them, his morning coffee untouched. "They're getting bolder. This isn't just about intimidation anymore. They're starting to cause real harm." Sarah's wheelchair turned with military precision as she faced them. Because intimidation wasn't enough. Men like Tank, they need escalation, need to prove their philosophy through force when words don't work. Through the window, they watched another group of riders circle the block. Their leather vests caught the morning light, the eagle emblems seeming more menacing with each pass. "Saw something interesting on their social media," Reynolds continued. "Tank's been posting about making an example here in Pine Haven, calling it a demonstration of medical natural selection." Lisa moved closer to Sarah's station. "What does that mean?" "Means he's planning something public," Sarah replied softly, her hands automatically checking her medical supplies. "Something designed to prove his point about strength and weakness. Something that will make those other clinics look like practice runs." The morning light strengthened as Sarah continued her duties, but now everyone noticed how she positioned her wheelchair at precise angles, maintaining clear views of all entrances. The calm efficiency that had once seemed simply professional now revealed its combat origins. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the windows, they watched as 2 Valley Riders confronted an elderly patient trying to enter the clinic. The man's walking cane seemed to particularly offend them. "Need a hand?" one rider called out mockingly, filming the encounter. "Or maybe you need to reconsider if you're really fit enough to receive medical care." Before anyone could react, Sarah's wheelchair was already moving. She navigated through the door with fluid grace, her presence immediately drawing the rider's attention. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, but her voice carried that steel edge they'd heard the day before. "Mr. Peterson is here for his appointment." The riders exchanged glances, clearly pleased to have drawn her out. Just having a discussion about medical fitness, the one with the phone said, smirking. About who really deserves treatment. Interesting philosophy, Sarah replied, her wheelchair positioning itself precisely between the riders and Mr. Peterson. Where did you learn your medical ethics? Same place Tank learned his in Kandahar? The smirks faltered slightly. Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched Sarah's posture change subtly, still calm, still controlled, but now carrying an unmistakable air of authority. You know about Kandahar? The second rider asked, his earlier mockery giving way to uncertainty. Know about a lot of things, Sarah said softly. Know about medical officers who abandon their duty. Know about what happens to those who think they can decide who deserves to live. Something in her voice, in the way she held herself in her wheelchair, made both riders step back involuntarily. Before they could respond, more motorcycles approached, Tank leading a larger group. Making friends, Sarah? Tank called out as he dismounted, his phone already recording. Teaching my men about your particular brand of medical weakness? Sarah's wheelchair turned to face him with military precision. Teaching them about duty, Jake. About the oaths we took, the ones you broke. Tank's face darkened. Through the window, Dr. Chen reached for the phone, ready to call for backup, but Reynolds stopped him. Watch, the officer said softly. Oaths, Tank spat the word. Oaths that waste resources on the weak, that dilute the strength of the human race. You're living proof of what happens when we prioritize weakness, a crippled medic, pretending she can still serve. Sarah's response carried clearly in the morning air, her voice deadly quiet. Interesting definition of weakness, coming from a man who abandoned children under fire, who left his post because he couldn't handle the reality of what service really means. The gathered riders shifted uneasily, looking between their leader and this wheelchair-bound woman who showed no fear. Tank's face contorted with rage. You don't know what happened there, he snarled. I was there, Sarah replied simply. Flying that chopper you left exposed, saving those children you deemed unworthy, taking that bullet because you decided your ideology was more important than your duty. The morning air grew thick with tension as understanding dawned among Tank's followers. Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched the scene unfold, seeing now why Sarah had maintained her silence about her past for so long. Some truths were weapons, best held in reserve until absolutely necessary. You're done here, Tank said finally, his voice carrying forced calm. By tonight, this clinic closes. One way or another, we're going to show everyone what happens when weakness is allowed to masquerade as strength. Interesting choice of words, Sarah observed quietly. Masquerade, pretense. Seems to me the only one pretending here is you, pretending that cruelty is strength, that fear is respect. Tank mounted his bike, his face a mask of cold fury. Get ready, flight nurse. Tonight we finish what started in Kandahar. Tonight everyone learns what real strength looks like. As the riders roared away, Sarah guided her wheelchair back into the clinic, her movements never betraying the tension Lisa could see in her shoulders. That was dangerous, Dr. Chen said, helping Mr. Peterson to his examination room, provoking him like that. He was already provoked, Sarah replied, her hands automatically returning to their precise organization of supplies. Men like Tank, they're always angry, always looking for justification. At least now we know what's coming. And what is coming? Lisa asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. Sarah's eyes met hers in the reflection of the clinic window. A test, she said softly, not just of this clinic or our service, but of what strength really means. Tank thinks he's going to prove his philosophy about weakness and worth. Her hands stilled on a roll of bandages. What he's actually going to prove is something he never learned in all his years of service, that real strength isn't about who you can intimidate, but about who you choose to protect. The morning continued as Sarah saw her patients, each movement of her wheelchair now carrying obvious tactical awareness. Through the windows, they could see Valley Riders maintaining their surveillance, their phones constantly recording, their presence a promise of escalation to come. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Pine Haven's main street as Sarah finished preparing the clinic for what she knew was coming. Tank's threat hung in the air like an approaching storm, making every passing motorcycle sound more ominous than the last. "They're gathering at the old factory," Reynolds reported, returning from his patrol. "Counting at least 30 bikes now. Tank's got them organized in teams, watching every approach to the clinic." Sarah's wheelchair turned smoothly as she assessed the clinic's layout one final time. Her military training showed in every precise movement, every calculated position. Time frame? Sun's going down in about an hour. They'll probably move. Then use the twilight for cover. Make it harder for security cameras to get clear footage. Dr. Chen approached from the back room, his face grave. "Sarah, most of our patients have cancelled their evening appointments. Words got out about Tank's threats. People are scared." "Good," Sarah replied quietly, surprising them. "Better they're not here for what's coming. Tank wants an audience, wants witnesses for his demonstration. The fewer civilians present, the fewer potential hostages or casualties." Lisa watched her friend's controlled movements, seeing now how every action served multiple purposes. The way Sarah positioned medical supplies wasn't just for convenience. She was creating clear lines of sight, establishing defensive positions. "You're really preparing for a fight," Lisa realized aloud. "Preparing for a choice," Sarah corrected, softly. "The same choice I made in Kandahar, between following the easy path and doing what's right." Through the windows, they could see more Valley Riders taking up positions around the clinic. Their phones remained raised, recording everything, waiting for what Tank had promised would be a lesson in real strength. The clinic door opened, admitting Emily Parker, a young nurse who'd recently joined their staff. "Sarah," she said breathlessly, "Tank's posted a new video. He's calling all medical professionals in the area to come witness what he calls the natural order being restored." Sarah's hands stilled on her wheelchair's arms. "Show me." Emily held out her phone, where Tank's latest social media post played. His face filled the screen, his voice carrying that false authority that had once commanded a medical evacuation team. "Tonight, we demonstrate why strength matters in medicine. Tonight, we show why letting weakness masquerade as capability endangers everyone. To all medical personnel in Pine Haven, come witness what happens when nature's law is ignored. Come see what real medical fitness looks like. He's not just targeting you anymore," Reynolds observed grimly. "He's trying to make this into some kind of public statement about medical standards." "Of course he is," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that quiet certainty they'd come to recognize. "Because this was never really about me. I'm just a symbol to him. Everything he hates about modern medicine. About service without discrimination. About strength being measured by more than physical perfection." The sun continued its descent as Tank's followers grew more numerous. They maintained their surveillance, their phones constantly recording, their presence a promise of escalation to come. "Last chance to call for backup," Reynolds offered, his hand resting on his radio. "Wouldn't get here in time," Sarah responded, her wheelchair moving with military precision as she made final preparations. "And Tank knows it. He's planned this carefully, chosen his moment, isolated his target, created his audience." Dr. Chen studied the gathering riders through the window. What's he actually planning? He can't just attack a medical facility. Even with his twisted ideology, that would destroy any credibility he has. "He doesn't need to attack," Sarah explained, her voice soft but carrying steel. "He just needs to prove his point about strength and weakness. needs to show his followers that some people don't deserve to provide medical care. The first sign of Tank's true plan came as emergency vehicles began reporting mechanical problems across town. Motorcycle accidents had mysteriously disabled most of Pine Haven's ambulances and police cars. Isolating us, Sarah noted with professional detachment, limiting potential interference. The second sign came when the power to the clinic's block suddenly cut out, plunging them into premature twilight. Emergency generators hummed to life, but they powered only essential medical equipment, leaving much of the building in shadow. "Sarah," Lisa said urgently, "we should evacuate while we can. This isn't about standing ground anymore. This is dangerous." "It's always been dangerous," Sarah replied, her wheelchair turning to face the gathering darkness outside. "Every time we let someone decide who deserves care and who doesn't, every time we accept that some people are worth more than others, that's the real danger." Through the clinic's windows, they could see Tank approaching on foot, flanked by his core followers. Each carried phones, recording what their leader had promised would be a demonstration of medical natural selection. "Final warning, flight nurse," Tank called out as he reached the clinic's entrance. "Close this facility voluntarily. Admit that some people aren't fit to provide medical care. Save yourself the public humiliation." Sarah's response carried clearly through the evening air, her voice deadly quiet but reaching every recording. "Phone. Like you saved yourself in Kandahar, Jake, by running when those children needed you." Tank's face darkened with rage. "You're about to learn what happens when weakness pretends to be strength." He turned to address his followers and their cameras. "Tonight, we demonstrate nature's law. Tonight, we show why physical fitness matters in medical care." But as he turned back to the clinic entrance, he found Sarah's wheelchair positioned there, her presence somehow filling the doorway despite her seated position. In the gathering darkness, something about her bearing had changed. No longer just the quiet medical professional, but the combat nurse who had flown through enemy fire to save lives. "You're right about one thing, Jake," she said softly, her voice carrying to every recording device. "Tonight is about strength, but not the kind you understand." "Really?" Tank sneered, playing to his audience. "You're going to demonstrate strength from that chair?" "Already am," Sarah replied calmly. "Every day I serve patients you'd reject, every life I save that you'd abandon, every time I prove that true medical care isn't about physical perfection. It's about being there for those who need help, regardless of their condition." The evening air grew heavy with tension as Tank's followers moved closer, their phones raised, waiting for their leader's signal. But something in Sarah's posture, in the absolute certainty of her presence, made them hesitate. "You're living proof of what happens when we let weakness into medicine," Tank declared, his voice rising for his recording audience. "Look at you, crippled, dependent, pretending you can still serve." "Interesting definition of service," Sarah responded, her voice carrying that quiet authority that had once commanded medical evacuations under fire. "Tell me, Jake, how many lives have you saved since Kandahar? How many patients have you helped since you decided some people weren't worthy of care?" Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched as Sarah's words hit their mark. Some of Tank's followers exchanged uncertain glances, their phones lowering slightly. "This isn't about past missions," Tank growled. "This is about standards, about strength. This is about fear," Sarah cut him off, her voice suddenly carrying the full weight of her combat experience. "Your fear, Jake. Fear that if we accept that everyone deserves care, that true strength lies in how we serve others rather than our physical condition, then everything you believe about worth and power crumbles." The evening shadows lengthened as Sarah continued, her words reaching every recording phone, every uncertain follower. "You want to demonstrate strength? True strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you choose to protect. It's not about who you reject, it's about who you choose to serve. The evening light faded as Tank processed Sarah's words, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and something else, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, of the combat nurse who had once defied his orders to save lives. Getting philosophical. "Won't save you," he snarled, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Won't change what's coming." Dr. Reynolds burst in through the back door, interrupting the confrontation. His face was tight with new information. "Sarah, there's more. Just got word from my Air Force contact. This isn't just about revenge. Tank's been building something bigger." Sarah's wheelchair turned with precise control, though her eyes never left Tank. "Tell me." "He's started an organization," Reynolds continued, his voice dropping lower, "calling it Medical Purity Front. They're not just targeting individual clinics. They're lobbying for legislation, trying to establish physical fitness requirements for medical licensing. Through the gathering darkness, they watched understanding dawn on Lisa's face. That's why he's recording everything. This isn't just harassment, it's propaganda. "More than that," Sarah replied softly, her hands resting lightly on her wheelchair's arms. "It's validation. He needs to prove his philosophy works, needs to show that physical perfection equals medical competence." Her eyes met Tank's. "Needs to justify what he did in Kandahar." Tank's laugh carried a bitter edge. "Still don't get it, do you? Kandahar was just the beginning. Those children, that hospital, they were weak. Nature's law says the weak don't survive. We were just helping nature along." Sarah's voice cut through the evening air like a surgical blade. "Nature's law? Is that what you told yourself when you left those children to die? When you ordered your men to abandon their posts? Those children were already broken," Tank spat, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "Just like you're broken now. Pretending you can still serve, still help people when you can't even stand on your own feet." Through the clinic windows, they could see more Valley Riders gathering, their phones raised, recording every word. But something had changed in their expressions, uncertainty creeping in as they watched their leader's composure slip. Dr. Chen moved closer to Sarah's position, his voice carrying quiet urgency. "Got more information about his organization. They're not just lobbying. They're establishing their own medical facilities, places that reject patients who don't meet their physical standards. Creating their own system," Sarah observed quietly. "Building an infrastructure to support their ideology." "Exactly," Reynolds confirmed, "and they're well funded. Someone's backing them, someone with resources and political connections." Tank's smile returned, cold and confident. "You're starting to understand now. This isn't just about one clinic in a small town. This is about the future of medicine itself, about ensuring only the fittest survive, only the strongest serve." Sarah's wheelchair moved with military precision, positioning herself more prominently in the doorway. Interesting choice of words. Survive. Serve. Tell them, Jake. Tell your followers what real service looked like in Kandahar. "You don't know what you're talking about," Tank growled, but his hand twitched slightly toward his jacket pocket. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah replied, her voice taking on that deadly quiet they'd heard before. "I know about the deals you made, the money you took to look the other way when certain patients needed care. Know about the consulting fees you received for deciding who was worth saving." The evening air grew heavy with tension as Tank's followers exchanged glances. This wasn't part of the narrative they'd been sold about medical purity and natural selection. "She's lying," Tank announced to his recording audience, but his voice carried a note of desperation, trying to distract from the real issue, that weakness in medicine endangers everyone. Then explain something, Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly to every phone. Explain why your bank accounts showed large deposits every time you declared patients unfit for treatment. Explain why those deposits came from companies that profited from denying medical care. Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched as some of Tank's followers lowered their phones, uncertainty plain on their faces. The story of medical purity was unraveling, revealing something darker beneath. "You're not just building an organization," Sarah said softly, but her words reached every ear. "You're building a business, profiting from pain, from denial of care, from turning medicine into a commodity only the worthy can access." Tank's facade cracked further, his face twisting with rage. "You think exposing this changes anything? You think these people care about money when I'm offering them power, the power to decide who lives, who dies, who deserves care?" "That's not power," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of combat experience. "That's corruption. That's betrayal of everything medical service stands for." Reynolds moved closer, his hand on his radio. "Just got confirmation. Federal investigations been tracking his organization's finances. They found links to pharmaceutical companies, insurance firms, anyone who profits from restricted medical access." The evening shadows lengthened as Tank's followers began to shift uneasily. The story they'd been sold about medical purity and natural selection was dissolving, revealing a web of profit and corruption beneath. "What you're really demonstrating here," Sarah continued, her words reaching every recording phone, "isn't strength or fitness, it's greed. Greed dressed up as philosophy, corruption masked as natural law." Tank's hand moved toward his jacket again, his composure cracking further. "Shut up. You don't understand what we're building." "I understand perfectly," Sarah cut him off, her wheelchair moving slightly forward. "You're building the same thing you tried to build in Kandahar, a system where money determines who deserves to live, where profit decides who receives care." Through the gathering darkness, they could see more Valley Riders arriving, but now they hung back, their phones lowering as they listened to the exchange. The narrative of medical purity was unraveling before their eyes, revealing the corrupt business beneath. "Your followers," Sarah observed quietly, "they believed in your philosophy about strength and fitness. How many of them know about the kickbacks? About the deals you make with companies that profit from denied care?" Tank's response was cut off by new arrivals, federal agents moving quietly through the shadows, taking positions around the clinic. The web of corruption he'd woven was beginning to close around him, but like all cornered predators, he was at his most dangerous. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, his hand finally pulling something from his jacket. "You think exposing the money matters when I can still prove my point about weakness?" The evening light caught metal as he raised a pistol, but Sarah's wheelchair was already moving, positioning herself between Tank and the clinic entrance with military precision. "Still trying to prove strength through violence," she said softly, her voice carrying that deadly certainty they remembered from her stories of Kandahar. "Still haven't learned what real power is." The moment hung in the air as Tank's followers watched their leader point a weapon at a wheelchair-bound nurse, their phones still recording, but now capturing a very different story than the one they'd come to tell. The last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across Pine Haven's streets as Tank stood with his weapon raised, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling around him. Sarah's wheelchair remained positioned in the clinic doorway, her presence somehow larger than her seated position would suggest. "Go ahead, Jake," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every recording phone. "Show everyone what your philosophy of strength really looks like. Show them how a trained medical officer proves his point by threatening a wheelchair-bound nurse." Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched federal agents continue to move into position, but she could see they were too far away to prevent Tank from firing if he chose to. Her heart pounded as she realized Sarah knew this too, was deliberately keeping Tank's attention focused on her. "You think this is about violence?" Tank snarled, his hand steady on the weapon. "This is about proving a point, about showing what happens when weakness is allowed to infect the medical profession." "No," Sarah replied, her wheelchair moving slightly forward. "This is about fear. Your fear, Jake. Fear that if people see through your ideology, see the corruption behind it, everything you've built collapses." Reynolds' voice crackled over the radio, tense but controlled. "Sarah, we've got more information. Tank's organization, they're not just denying care, they're profiting from it. Every patient they reject gets referred to specific facilities, specific treatment centers. All owned by shell companies," Sarah finished softly, her eyes, "never leaving Tanks. All paying kickbacks to those who send them patients. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not strength or fitness, but money." Tank's followers shifted uneasily, their phones still recording, but now capturing a story of corruption rather than medical purity. Through the gathering darkness, they could see doubt replacing conviction on their faces. "You're lying," Tank announced, but his voice carried an edge of desperation, trying to distract from the real issue. "The real issue?" Sarah's voice cut through the evening air like a combat medic's scalpel. "Let's talk about real issues, Jake. Let's talk about the children in Kandahar, not just the ones you abandoned, but the ones you were paid to declare unfit for treatment." Tank's hand tightened on his weapon. "Shut up, you don't know." "I know everything," Sarah replied, her voice deadly quiet. "About the deals you made with private medical contractors, about how they paid you to reject local patients so they could fill beds with more profitable cases, about how you dressed up greed as medical philosophy." Dr. Chen moved closer to the doorway, his voice carrying urgent warning. "Sarah, he's desperate now. Men like that, when their lies are exposed, they resort to what they know best," Sarah finished. "Violence, intimidation, the illusion of strength through force." Her wheelchair moved forward another inch. "But there's something you never learned in all your years of service, Jake. Something about real strength." Tank's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance, flight nurse. Close this clinic. Admit I'm right about weakness in medicine or what?" Sarah's voice carried that same quiet certainty she'd shown in Kandahar. "You'll shoot me? Prove your philosophy about medical fitness by gunning down a disabled nurse. Is that what strength looks like to you?" Through the clinic windows, they could see Tank's followers lowering their phones, backing away. The story of medical purity had transformed into something darker, something that couldn't be justified by any ideology. "You don't understand what's at stake," Tank growled. "The contracts, the arrangements, millions in funding, deals with pharmaceutical companies, insurance providers." "I understand perfectly," Sarah cut him off. "Understanding was my job in Kandahar. Understanding why a decorated medical officer would abandon his post, betray his oath. It wasn't ideology that made you run that day, was it? It was profit. Those children weren't profitable enough to save." The evening air grew heavy with tension as Tank's composure cracked further. His weapon remained pointed at Sarah, but his hand had begun to shake slightly. "You think exposing this changes anything?" he snarled. "You think these people care about corruption when I'm offering them power? The power to decide who lives, who dies. That's not power," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of combat experience. "That's the illusion of power, real strength. It's not about who you can reject or who you can hurt. It's about who you choose to help, who you choose to serve." Lisa watched from inside as Sarah's words reached every recording phone, every uncertain follower. The narrative of medical purity was dissolving, revealing the corrupt business beneath. Your followers, Sarah continued softly, they believed in your philosophy about strength and fitness. How many of them know about the kickbacks? About how you profit from every patient you declare unworthy of care? Tank's weapon wavered slightly. You're destroying everything I've built. You destroyed it yourself, Sarah cut him off. The moment you decided profit was more important than patience. The moment you dressed up greed as natural law. The federal agents had moved closer, but Tank's finger remained on the trigger, his face twisted with rage and desperation. I can still prove my point, still show everyone what happens when weakness is allowed to what? Sarah's voice carried that deadly quiet they remembered from her stories of Kandahar. To serve others? To save lives? To demonstrate that true strength isn't about physical perfection, but about how you use whatever abilities you have to help those in need. Through the gathering darkness, they could see Tank's followers continuing to back away, their phones now recording their leader's descent from philosopher of strength to desperate armed man threatening a wheelchair-bound nurse. This isn't about strength anymore, Jake, Sarah said softly. It never was. It's about choices. The choices you made in Kandahar, the choices you're making now. Choices that show exactly what kind of strength you really believe in. The moment stretched like a drawn wire as Tank stood with his weapon raised, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. But he had made one final, crucial mistake. He'd chosen to threaten someone who had learned about real strength not in moments of power, but in moments of service. Someone who had discovered that true courage isn't about standing tall, but about staying steady when others flee. Someone who had proven in the skies over Kandahar and in a small-town clinic that real strength isn't measured by what you can destroy, but by what you choose to protect. The clinic's emergency lights cast uneven shadows as Tank stood with his weapon trained on Sarah, his carefully constructed empire of medical purity dissolving into a revelation of corruption. The evening air hummed with tension as federal agents continued their careful approach, but everyone knew they wouldn't reach Tank before he could pull the trigger. "You've got one last choice here, Jake," Sarah said quietly, her wheelchair positioned with combat medic's precision. "One last chance to show what kind of strength you really believe in." Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched as Sarah subtly adjusted her position, each movement calculated and purposeful. She realized her friend wasn't just talking, she was preparing, positioning herself with the same tactical awareness that had once kept patients alive under enemy fire. "Choice!" Tank's laugh carried a manic edge. "You're taking away all my choices. The organization, the funding, the contracts, everything I've built. Everything you've corrupted," Sarah corrected softly. "Every oath you've broken, every patient. You've betrayed for profit, but there's still one thing you haven't lost completely." Reynolds moved carefully closer to the doorway, his voice low with urgent warning. "Sarah, he's got nothing left to lose now. Men like that always have one thing left," Sarah finished, her eyes never leaving Tank. "Their truth. Question is, Jake, are you ready to face yours?" Tank's finger tightened on the trigger. "What truth? That weakness doesn't deserve..." "That! You ran!" Sarah cut him off, her voice carrying that deadly quiet they'd heard before. "Not just in Kandahar, but every time you chose profit over patience, every time you dressed up greed as natural law, every time you pretended corruption was strength." Dr. Chen watched from inside as Sarah's words reached every recording phone, every uncertain follower. The story of medical purity was unraveling, revealing something darker beneath. "Those children in Kandahar," Sarah continued, her wheelchair moving slightly forward. "Tell your followers the truth about them, about how much you were paid to declare them unfit for treatment, about the private contractors waiting to fill those beds with more profitable patients." Tank's hand shook slightly on his weapon. "You don't understand what was at stake." "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied, her voice steady. Understanding kept me alive in that helicopter after you abandoned your post. Understanding kept those children breathing when you decided they weren't worth saving. Understanding shows me exactly what you're going to do next. Through the gathering darkness, they could see Tank's followers continuing to back away, their phones still recording, but now capturing a very different story than they'd come to tell. You think you know what I'm going to do? Tank snarled, his finger white on the trigger. I know you're going to make the same choice you always make, Sarah said softly. The choice between real strength and its illusion, between serving others and serving yourself. Lisa moved closer to the doorway, her heart pounding as she watched her friend face down an armed man from her wheelchair. But now she saw what others were beginning to see, that the wheelchair wasn't a limitation, but a position of power, a demonstration that true strength comes in many forms. Your followers, Sarah continued, her voice reaching every recording device, they believed your story about medical purity, about natural selection. How many of them know the real numbers, Jake? How much you've made from each rejected patient? How many lives you've traded for profit? Tank's weapon wavered slightly. Money doesn't change the truth about strength. No, Sarah agreed quietly, but it reveals the truth about you, about what you really believe in, about why you really ran in Kandahar. The federal agents had moved closer, but everyone knew they were still too far away to prevent Tank from firing. Yet something in Sarah's calm certainty, in the absolute control of her positioned wheelchair, made even Tank hesitate. You're trying to distract me, he growled, trying to turn this into something else. I'm trying to give you one last chance, Sarah corrected softly. One last opportunity to show real strength instead of its counterfeit, to choose service over profit, truth over ideology. Through the clinic windows, they could see more Valley Riders arriving, but now they hung back. Their phones capturing the moment their leader's philosophy of strength crumbled into a revelation of greed and corruption. Your organization, Sarah continued, her wheelchair moving with combat medic's precision, it's not just about denying care anymore, is it? It's about directing it. Every patient you reject gets referred to specific facilities, specific treatments, all connected to your shell companies, all paying you to send them business. Tank's composure cracked further. You think exposing this changes anything? You think these people care about money when I'm offering them power? Power. Sarah's voice carried that quiet authority that had once commanded medical evacuations under fire. The power to profit from pain? To dress up greed as natural law? That's not power, Jake. That's cowardice wearing a mask of strength. The evening. Shadows lengthened as Sarah's words reached every uncertain follower, every recording phone. The narrative of medical purity was dissolving, revealing the corrupt business beneath. You're destroying everything, Tank snarled, his weapon steady but his voice shaking. No, Sarah replied softly. You destroyed it yourself. Every time you chose profit over patience, every time you abandoned your duty for money, every time you pretended corruption was strength. Through the gathering darkness, they could see federal agents continuing their careful approach, but everyone knew what would happen next would depend not on their intervention, but on the choices made in these next crucial moments. Last chance, Jake, Sarah said quietly, her wheelchair positioned with combat veterans' precision. Show everyone what kind of strength you really believe in. Show them if you're still the man who runs when duty calls, who abandons patience for profit, who pretends greed is natural law. The moment stretched like a drawn wire as Tank stood with his weapon raised, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. But he had made one final crucial mistake. He'd chosen to threaten someone who had learned about real strength, not in moments of victory, but in moments of service. Someone who had discovered that true power isn't about standing tall, but about staying steady when others flee. Someone who had proven, in the skies over Kandahar and in a small-town clinic, that real strength isn't measured by what you can destroy, but by what you choose to protect. And in that moment, as evening shadows lengthened across Pine Haven, Sarah Mitchell sat calmly in her wheelchair, demonstrating with every steady breath what real strength looks like when it chooses to serve rather than dominate, to protect rather than destroy. The evening shadows deepened around Pine Haven community. Center as Tank stood with his weapon aimed at Sarah, his empire of medical purity crumbling into revealed corruption. The air hummed with tension as federal agents continued their careful approach, but everyone knew the next moments would be decided by choices, not intervention. "You really think this ends well for you?" Tank snarled, his finger white on the trigger. "You think exposing the money changes what weakness looks like?" Sarah's wheelchair remained perfectly positioned in the clinic doorway, her presence somehow filling the space with quiet authority. "This isn't about weakness anymore, Jake. This is about truth, about choices, about what real strength looks like when the masks come off." Through the clinic windows, Lisa watched as more Valley Riders arrived, but now they hung back, their phones recording a very different story than the one they'd come to tell. The narrative of medical purity had transformed into a revelation of greed and corruption. Truth? Tank's laugh carried an edge of desperation. "The truth is, you're sitting in that chair while I'm standing here with a gun. That's nature's law right there." "Interesting definition of law," Sarah replied softly, her voice carrying that combat medic's certainty, standing with a weapon, threatening someone who serves others. "Is that what strength looked like in Kandahar too? When you ran while children needed you?" Tank's composure cracked further. "Shut up about Kandahar. You don't know." "I know everything," Sarah cut him off, her wheelchair moving slightly forward. "About the deals you made, the money you took, the patients you abandoned for profit. Your followers are learning too, Jake. Look at their faces. Look at what real truth does to false strength." Through the gathering darkness, they could see uncertainty and disgust replacing conviction on the faces of Tank's followers. Their phones remained raised, but now they were documenting the unraveling of their leaders' carefully constructed lies. "You think these people care about money?" Tank demanded, his weapon steady but his voice shaking. "You think they'll choose weakness over strength just because they've learned what you really believe in?" Sarah finished quietly. "Because they've seen how you measure strength in dollars instead of service? Because they've watched you threaten a wheelchair-bound nurse while talking about medical purity?" Dr. Chen moved carefully closer to the doorway, his voice carrying urgent warning. "Sarah, he's got nothing left to lose now. When men like that are cornered." "They make choices," Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving Tank. "Just like in Kandahar. Just like every time profit meant more than patience. The question is, Jake, what choice are you making now?" The evening air grew heavy with tension as Tank's finger tightened on the trigger. But something in Sarah's calm certainty, in the absolute control of her positioned wheelchair, made him hesitate. "You're trying to turn them against me," he growled, "trying to destroy everything I've built." "You destroyed it yourself," Sarah corrected softly. "Every time you chose money over medicine, every time you dressed up greed as natural law, every time you pretended corruption was strength." Through the clinic windows, they watched as more of Tank's followers backed away, their phones capturing the moment their leader's philosophy of medical fitness crumbled into revealed avarice. "Your organization," Sarah continued, her voice reaching every recording device, "it wasn't built on strength or fitness. It was built on kickbacks, on referral fees, on profiting from denied care. Tell them, Jake. Tell your followers how much you make every time you declare someone unworthy of treatment." Tank's weapon wavered slightly, Money doesn't change the truth about weakness. No, Sarah agreed quietly, but it reveals the truth about you, about what you really believe in, about why you really ran in Kandahar. The federal agents had moved closer, but everyone knew what happened next would depend not on their intervention, but on the choices made in these crucial moments. "Last chance," Sarah said softly, her wheelchair positioned with combat veterans' precision. "Show everyone what kind of strength you really believe in. Show them if you're still the man who runs when duty calls, who abandons patience for profit, who pretends greed is natural law." Tank's finger tightened on the trigger, his face twisted with rage and desperation. But in that moment, something happened that no one expected. One of his core followers, a man who had believed deeply in the ideology of medical purity, stepped forward and lowered his phone. "She's right," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I just checked the documents she mentioned, the shell companies, the kickbacks, the referral fees. It's all true." The revelation rippled through the gathered crowd like a shockwave. More phones lowered as Tank's followers began accessing the evidence Sarah had carefully prepared, seeing for themselves the corrupt business behind their leader's philosophy. "You don't understand," Tank snarled, his weapon still aimed at Sarah. "The money doesn't matter. What matters is strength, is fitness. What matters," Sarah cut him off, her voice carrying that quiet authority that had once commanded medical evacuations under fire, "is choice. Every time we choose who deserves care and who doesn't. Every time we decide profit matters more than patience. Every time we pretend cruelty is strength." Through the gathering darkness, they watched as Tank's remaining followers began to move away, their phones now documenting not a demonstration of strength, but the unraveling of a corrupt empire. "It's over, Jake," Sarah said softly. "Your followers. See the truth now. See what your philosophy of strength really means. The only question left is what choice you make in this moment." Tank's finger tightened on the trigger one final time, but as he looked around at his dispersing followers, at the federal agents moving closer, at the quiet strength of the wheelchair-bound nurse who had exposed his corruption, something in him finally broke. The weapon lowered slowly as Tank's carefully constructed world collapsed around him. In the end, he made the same choice he'd made in Kandahar. He turned to run, but this time there was nowhere to go. Federal agents moved in swiftly, securing him with professional efficiency. As they led him away, Sarah's voice carried clearly to every remaining phone. "Remember this moment," she said quietly. "Remember what real strength looks like, not in standing with weapons, but in serving with compassion, not in rejecting the vulnerable, but in protecting them, not in profit, but in purpose." The evening. Shadows lengthened across Pine Haven as Tank's followers dispersed, their phones having captured not a demonstration of medical purity, but a lesson in what true strength really means. And in the clinic doorway, Sarah Mitchell remained in her wheelchair, demonstrating with every steady breath that real power isn't measured by physical perfection or force of arms, but by the choices we make when duty calls and others need our help. The first light of dawn painted Pine Haven's sky in shades of promise as federal agents processed the scene outside the community center. Through the clinic windows, Sarah watched Tank being led to a waiting vehicle, his empire of medical purity transformed into evidence of corruption. "Still having trouble believing it," Lisa said softly, joining her friend at the window. "All this time, the quiet nurse running our free clinic was actually exactly who she appeared to be," Sarah completed, her wheelchair turning with measured grace. "Someone who chose to serve others, who believed in helping everyone, who needed care. The only difference is now people understand where that choice came from." Officer Reynolds entered through the back door, his face showing both exhaustion and relief. "Just got the preliminary reports. Tank's organization It went deeper than anyone realized. Pharmaceutical companies, insurance providers, private medical facilities, all profiting from denied care. Not anymore, Sarah replied quietly, her hands automatically organizing supplies on her desk. But now everyone saw these movements for what they really were, the ingrained habits of someone who had learned to stay ready, to maintain order in the midst of chaos. Dr. Chen approached, holding his tablet. News is spreading fast. Tank's followers are coming forward, sharing their stories. The corruption, the kickbacks, the way he twisted medical ethics into profit margins. Through the morning light, they could see more vehicles arriving, journalists, federal investigators, medical oversight committees. The story of Pine Haven's wheelchair-bound nurse who exposed a corrupt medical empire was spreading rapidly. "You could have told us sooner," Lisa observed, watching Sarah maintain her precise routine despite the chaos outside. "About Kandahar, about what you did there." "Telling isn't always helping," Sarah replied, her wheelchair moving with that same measured grace they now recognized from her combat days. "Sometimes the best service is quiet, letting your actions speak instead of your words." Reynolds settled into a chair, his face thoughtful. But something changed, didn't it? When Tank showed up, when he started spreading his ideology about strength and fitness. "What changed?" Sarah said softly. "Was the threat. Not to me, but to what medicine should be. To the idea that everyone deserves care, that true medical service isn't about physical perfection or profit margins." Through the windows, they watched as more of Tank's former followers gathered, but now they came not to intimidate but to learn. Many carried medical credentials, their beliefs about strength and fitness transformed by the previous night's revelations. "You're not just changing minds about Tank," Dr. Chen noted, showing Sarah his tablet where social media exploded with discussions about medical ethics, about service, about what true strength really means. "You're changing how people think about ability, about service, about what makes someone fit to help others." Sarah's wheelchair turned smoothly as she faced them. That's what Tank never understood. Real strength, real fitness for medical service. It was never about physical condition. It was always about choices, about who you choose to help, who you choose to serve. The morning light strengthened as more people arrived at the clinic. Not just journalists and investigators, but patients returning, community members showing support, medical professionals seeking guidance. "Got word from the medical board," Reynolds reported, checking his phone. "They're launching a full investigation into discriminatory practices in healthcare, using what happened here as a catalyst for change." "Change," Sarah repeated softly, her hands moving with combat medics. Precision, as she prepared for the day's patients. That's what Tank really feared. Not weakness, not disability, but the change that comes when we recognize that true strength has many forms. Lisa watched as her friend maintained her routine, seeing now how every action served multiple purposes. Organizing supplies while maintaining awareness, helping patients while teaching lessons about service. "You're different now," she observed. "Not just the quiet nurse anymore, but not just the combat medic either. Something more complete." "Had to change," Sarah agreed softly. "Had to become what was needed. Not just someone who could expose corruption, but someone who could show a different kind of strength." Through the morning light, they watched as Pine Haven itself seemed to transform. The fear that had gripped the town during Tank's presence was being replaced by something stronger, a community understanding that true power comes not from intimidation, but from service. "They're calling you a hero," Dr. Chen said, showing another news article. "The wheelchair-bound nurse who brought down a corrupt medical empire." "No heroes here," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that quiet certainty they'd come to recognize. "Just choices. Choices about who we serve, how we serve, what we're willing to stand for or sit for," she added, with a small smile. The clinic began filling with its usual morning patients, but now everyone saw Sarah's work differently. Each movement of her wheelchair carried new meaning. Each interaction demonstrated what she'd been teaching all along, that true medical service isn't about physical condition, but about dedication to helping others. "You know what amazes me most?" Lisa asked, watching Sarah guide her wheelchair with practiced grace between patients. "How natural it feels now. How something that started with such conflict could turn into such peace." "Not just peace," Sarah corrected gently, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she treated an elderly patient. "Purpose. Understanding that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in what we can do physically, but in how we choose to serve others." Through the windows they could see more former Valley Riders arriving, but now they came seeking something different. Understanding, guidance, a new way to think about strength and service. "They're learning," Reynolds observed, "not just about Tank's corruption, but about what real medical ethics look like, about what true service means." Sarah's wheelchair turned smoothly as she finished with her patient. "They're learning what I learned in Kandahar, what I've been practicing here every day. That real strength isn't about physical perfection or power over others. It's about being there when people need help, about using whatever abilities you have to serve others." The morning continued as Pine Haven adjusted to its new reality. The clinic, that had once been targeted for its wheelchair-bound nurse, had become a symbol of transformation, a place where true medical service was demonstrated, not through physical prowess, but through dedication to helping others. And at its heart, Sarah Mitchell continued her work, her wheelchair moving with the same measured grace that had once guided medical evacuations through combat zones. She had become something unique, not just a quiet nurse, not just a combat veteran, but a living demonstration that true strength lies not in physical condition, but in the choices we make when others need our help. The transformation was complete, not just for Sarah or the clinic, but for everyone who had witnessed what happened when false strength confronted true service, when corruption faced genuine dedication, when the power of profit met the strength of purpose. The morning sun cast golden light through the Pine Haven Community Center's windows as Sarah guided her wheelchair through her familiar routine. 1 month had passed since Tank's arrest, but the changes that night had sparked continued to ripple outward. "Got another interview request," Lisa announced, holding up her tablet. "National Medical Ethics Journal wants to talk about how a small-town free clinic changed the conversation about fitness and service in healthcare." Sarah continued organizing supplies, her movements carrying that same measured grace that had once guided medical evacuations through combat zones. "Tell them what we always tell them. The clinic's open to anyone who wants to learn about real medical service." Through the windows, they could see new faces arriving. Medical students, healthcare professionals, people drawn by the story of how a wheelchair-bound combat nurse had exposed corruption while demonstrating true strength. "It's different now," Dr. Chen observed, watching Sarah work. "Not just the clinic or the town, but how people think about medical service, about ability, about what real fitness means." Sarah's wheelchair turned smoothly as she faced him. Different because it needed to be. Because sometimes the best way to fight false strength is to demonstrate true service. The morning light caught her silver hair as she moved between patients, each action carrying both professional efficiency and combat awareness. But now, these qualities weren't hidden. They were part of what she taught, what she demonstrated, every day. "Got the final reports from the federal investigation," Reynolds said, entering with fresh coffee. "Tank's organization. It went beyond what anyone imagined. Dozens of clinics affected, hundreds of patients denied care for profit." "And now?" Sarah asked quietly, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. Now those clinics are being transformed. Medical boards are rewriting policies about fitness and service. People are learning what you've been teaching all along, that true medical care isn't about physical condition, but about dedication to helping others. Through the morning light, they watched as more people arrived at the clinic. Not just patients now, but observers, learners, people seeking to understand what real medical service looks like. 3 more veterans joined the program, Lisa reported, checking her notes. All with combat injuries, all wanting to learn how to serve in healthcare despite physical limitations. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she prepared. Treatment supplies. No limitations, she corrected gently, just different ways of serving, different forms of strength. The clinic had evolved, becoming not just a place of healing, but a center for learning, for transformation. Medical professionals came to study how a wheelchair-bound nurse maintained perfect efficiency, how physical challenges could be transformed into unique perspectives on patient care. Remember what Tank used to say? Dr. Chen asked, watching Sarah guide a young medical student through a procedure, about how physical perfection was necessary for medical service. Remember what he really meant, Sarah replied softly. How profit mattered more than patience, how corruption wore a mask of strength, but people are learning different lessons now. Through the windows, they could see former Valley Riders arriving, not as intimidators now, but as students. Many had returned to medical training, their understanding of strength and service transformed by what they'd witnessed. You've created something unique here, Reynolds observed, watching the interaction between veteran medical professionals and new learners. Not just a clinic, but a new way of thinking about medical service. Sarah's wheelchair moved with military precision as she addressed a group of observers. Not created, she corrected, revealed. The truth about service was always here, in every patient who needed help, in every provider who chose to give it, in every moment we choose dedication over discrimination. The morning continued as Sarah demonstrated procedures, shared experiences, taught lessons about service that went beyond physical ability. Her wheelchair was no longer something to hide or overcome. It was part of her teaching, showing how true medical care adapts, innovates, finds ways to help regardless of circumstances. Got word from the medical board, Dr. Chen announced, checking his emails. They're using our clinic as a model for new training programs, teaching medical students about adaptive techniques, about how different abilities bring different strengths to patient care. Teaching them what matters most. Sarah agreed softly, her hands moving with combat medic's efficiency as she treated a young patient. Not physical condition, but dedication to service. Not perfect ability, but perfect commitment. Through the morning light, they watched Pine Haven itself continue to transform. The town that had once feared Tank's presence had become a symbol of what healthcare could be. Inclusive, adaptive, focused on service rather than superficial standards. You know what amazes me most? Lisa asked, watching Sarah work. How natural it all feels now. How something that started with such conflict has become such a powerful force for change. Sarah's wheelchair turned smoothly as she finished with her patient. Because it's real, she replied quietly. Real service, real dedication, real strength. They don't need force or fear. They just need to be demonstrated day after day, patient after patient. The clinic continued to fill with its morning routine. Regular patients mixing with observers, students learning alongside experienced professionals, everyone witnessing what true medical service looks like when it focuses on dedication rather than physical perfection. They're not just learning medical procedures, Reynolds noted, watching the interactions. They're learning about service, about adaptation, about what real strength looks like in action. Learning what I learned in Kandahar, Sarah agreed softly, her wheelchair moving with practiced grace between patients. That true strength isn't about physical condition or power over others. It's about being there when people need help, about using whatever abilities you have to serve others. The morning light strengthened as Pine Haven embraced its new role, not just as a small town with a free clinic, but as a center for transforming how people think about medical service, about ability, about what makes someone truly fit to help others. And at its heart, Sarah Mitchell continued her work, her wheelchair moving with the same measured grace that had once guided medical evacuations through combat zones. She had become something unique, not just a quiet nurse, not just a combat veteran, but a living demonstration that true strength lies not in physical condition, but in the choices we make when others need our help. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. The transformation was complete, not just for Sarah or the clinic, but for everyone who witnessed what happened when false strength confronted true service, when corruption faced genuine dedication, when the power of profit met the strength of purpose. Pine Haven had become more than just a town. It had become a symbol of what healthcare could be when it focused on service rather than superficial standards, on dedication rather than discrimination, on the true strength that comes from choosing to help others, regardless of physical condition or circumstance.